my prerogative as the chair. About once a year in my house of worship, I read the Ten Commandments. And usually they ask you, say something about it. Sure, you can read it, but say something about it. And so I usually try to look at, well, what other lists have we been doing, have we been paying attention to, or have become important to people? For example, Google's 8 guides to the best manager, something like that. So I use, but you've just given me a good 6.
I give you 6 good.
And so next year I'll use you. I want to mention that when you say, oh, this is just a legislative district, I'm just doing this for a legislative district, typically when you're in the at the local level, you're dealing much more with the people, and
Right.
It's much more real.
Yes.
When you're dealing with nations, you're actually also dealing people with people. But you think you're dealing with these grand groups, the United States, or the Muslims, or the Christians. But you deal, basically, it's one-to-one. Someone asked me, do you know any Muslims? Do you know any blacks? I say, well, I'm not, I say, well, I know Sam, and I know Jennifer, and I know, and yes, they might be, but it's an individual.
Yes.
So anyway, I think the things we learn at the one-to-one level ultimately impacts the whole world. So I could go on, but I think we might. Would anybody like to?
I'm sorry. Yes, this gentleman has.
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I really appreciated your the thoughts you giving to us. I studied conflict resolution from the master's up to the PhD level, both in France and here in the United States. And honestly, listening to you, I mean, I've read a lot, but listening to you, I feel you have just a broad understanding of what many of us have spent many years studying. What John Paul Lederer, one of the leaders of our field, conflict resolution, he talked about building an infrastructure of peace.
Yes.
And what you have laid out this morning for me is that infrastructure of peace. And I want to thank you a lot for this because I believe this is what this organization stands for. And as you were speaking, I was like, were you there when the International Center for Ethno-Religious Mediation started? It seems to me you have like an in-depth understanding of the mission of this organization. And one thing I was just thinking about, I was going to ask you is, how do you think, from a practical perspective, we can implement not just the educational aspect of what you said, which is teaching inclusive controversial publications,
Right.
But how can we implement the other things like dialogue and other practical things that you talked about?
Well, one, thank you for the compliment. And I certainly went back and looked at the founding principles of the organization and conflict resolution, and I tried to fit my remarks into that context. And I appreciate the work, because on an international level, I was talking about this very granular level, but internationally these problems are so great, and credit to all of you for being involved in that and taking the lead and being here on that. I think some things cross over all boundaries. People meeting in a social situation with people who are different. having the experience of, for example, and I don't know how this translates in other countries as well as it does here, but one of the things that's been a beautiful experience for me personally and an eye-opening experience is to go to other places of worship and experience firsthand how they see the world. I've been to many mosques. I was recently, as I mentioned, in this Buddhist experience, which I had never been in before, right in my district, a big church, they don't call it a church, and they explained all their deities and all this stuff which I really knew nothing about. Fascinating to me. I'm open, but I think this, and that's just in the faith world, not everyone is interested in that, but the opportunity to sit down with people who disagree or who are different is so powerful. We're quite isolated, and I can't speak to the other parts of the world as well, but in the United States, we have this segregation by housing, by school, and it has led to our failure to interact with someone who doesn't look like us, doesn't speak like us, speaks a different language. So I think the social is one thing. I think, and again, this just goes to being an elected official, having people that represent diversity in elected office, which I didn't talk about, is extremely important. I am in a New York State Senate that is, I would say, in our Democratic conference, that's the Democrats in the supermajority in my house, is majority minority. Many of them are under 35 years old. They bring activism, a sense of their community, particularly if their community is Asian or African American, Caribbean, all the things that makes New York great. So I think that's another experience, having elected officials who speak on behalf of these issues. Otherwise, very frankly, and I've been around politics a long time, they go to the bottom of the pile, the bottom of the thing. So I think a number of my ideas, they're not my ideas, they're just practical things, can be transferred. And I didn't mention the voting diversity issue, which I think is quite important here in the United States, where we have such a diverse nation, and traditionally we only had white men in power, and I think that is changing and for the better. But I think a number of the issues, aside from education, are transferable. The social media thing, that's a worldwide challenge, and I don't think we have it really under control. And I could just say for young people who are getting all their news and information and misinformation from social media, I mean, sometimes it's a wonderful thing. I mean, I think they tried to shut it down in Iran, and the American government is trying to open it back up because that was the way you knew who they were taking away and beating up. So I think a lot of the things are transferable, and I'm happy to work on them over time and develop them further. But I have so much respect for this field that you are in. I think there's an academic field here that does it, but for those of us like in the, way down here on the bottom with the regular folks every day, we're not as exposed to it and as knowledgeable as we could be. Mm-hmm. But thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
I think, yes.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for the opportunity. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, 2 or 2.5 parts question. First, what do you think people lost the interest in politics or to participate? Is it that because people are so poor, the economy is so bad, and people are just chasing life, they have no time to engage in it? Or is this social media, with the social media like misinformation, that people just became so consumed and that they don't have a time, to really even focus on what possibly matters? Like in your generation, you say people participated in different board for common good, but you don't see that interest. Is it because social media, or is it because of just poverty? I mean, yes, a small number of people are getting very rich, but majority of people are really becoming poor. Why do you think that? And do we even think, even U.S., I'm an immigrant myself, but have the capacity really to reinventing it. I mean, back in the day, and from what I read, is that the government played a guiding role for society by investing in it. Does our government, does the American government, have the resource, even the interest, really to invest into this? Because I'll give you, as an immigrant myself, immigration is a good thing. So, but like everything else, there's up and then the downside of that. One, it opened up a channel for human traffickers. People are leaving their countries in millions in poverty, but then there's really no way for some countries to accept all these people. It's just not possible. So there's up and downs. Does our government have, does the US government have even the capacity or the interest to really guide this? And then you also have an angle of, our generation is like feel good, in the moment, it's like we're not really interested about long term. Just I want to feel good in that. I mean, is there even a system, and do we even understand that? So anyway, question, and I just felt like it's everything is interconnected, and I'm speaking myself later on. What's happening here in this district is a reflection of the whole country. You mentioned about the racism, and the reflection of the whole country is the whole world is really going through a very difficult time. You see what's happening, how conflict everywhere, and the UN is really unable to address. So I felt like everything is interconnected. Do we have even the ability to, if you can answer this smaller one, maybe something like that? Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's a complicated question. I'll do my best. I think underpinning that is the role that poverty plays in keeping people out of this conversation and engaged in politics or in government or in civic life. And in my experience, I've represented very poor communities mixed with very rich communities. And traditionally, the poorest of my constituents, truly, truly poor, did not vote and did not participate. They have enough to get through their lives, and they don't have the bandwidth because they are focused on money and food and their kids and those things. And I've always had people like that in my district. I've always spoken with them and served them. But the poorest of our constituents have much bigger problems than who they vote for and participating, in my experience. And I understand that. But in my district, for example, I have many people who are working, what I would call working poor. They're working a minimum wage job. They have trouble making their housing costs here, very expensive housing. They have trouble with the costs for their kids, things associated with their children or their parents. They're willing to participate. They're cynical about the value of government in their lives. Like you said, there was a time when government was sort of seen as a path upward. One, they're cynical in general because of divisions within our country, and they feel like everyone is tarnished. And secondly, they're cynical because they don't feel like anyone is helping them. Now, I would just tell you, like in my district, we had a terrible, terrible hurricane and flood last year. Terrible. 3 people died in my district. Hundreds of people lost their homes. So the state created a fund to help reimburse people, but only sort of the poorer people got the money. So the middle income and above, and some racism, came to me and like, well, how come the Latino people are getting it? And how come us white people who've been working all these years and paying taxes, we're not getting it? We lost everything also. So it is ironic that the efforts of government to help those who need the most in this moment is used in a sort of racist way by those in the middle. So I just think one of our problems is with these people, the point I was making before, which you're saying is, why not see that we're trying to raise everybody up? We're trying to raise everyone up. And if you only have limited resources, we're going to target it at those with the least need. It's not punishing people who have more. But right now, there's such an air in this country of resentment against everybody that what you're talking about, like, these people are not too poor to participate or too poor to engage, but they're cynical. I don't think it's social media. I honestly think Trump and we didn't talk about it, he contributed to this sort of open airing of grievances, which is now legitimized in this country. Like, you know, I can be resentful because you're sitting at that table and I'm not. Instead of saying, good for you, you're sitting at that table, that's wonderful. I wish I could sit at that table with you. There's a very resentful-filled tone. So I think poverty is an issue, as you've identified, a big issue, and in the United States and around the world, and people being not engaged in this process and cynical. But many people who are not as poor as that are still very turned off here, and I face that challenge. But I'd be interested if I could stay for your remarks to learn more about what you're going to say. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good start. I start by introducing myself. I'm Salman Omar from Kurdistan region of Iraq.
From where?
Kurdistan region of Iraq.
Kurdistan.
Region of Iraq. So you mentioned through your 6 point that we should the school curriculum basically could be like primary, secondary, should include the genocide, and we teach the student what happened, or you mentioned about the Holocaust. I don't know if you have, for sure you have it, but I wanted to explanation about the recent genocide that happened against the Yazidi community, which is a member of the big Kurdish nation in 2040-70 by the Islamic terrorist group. So if I ask you this question, and if you have the answer, how you do evaluate the role of the international community in order to determine the danger of the terrorist group, no anymore genocide against the minority ethno based in a religion point or even the national point? And thanks.
No, it's a really good question so ironically, New York law on this is all over the map, not just the Holocaust. The Irish potato famine is required to be taught. Why? Really? Because there were a lot of Irish American legislators one year who said, here was something terrible that happened, and we ought to make sure people are taught about it. There are other genocides. I have a bill to ensure the Holodomor in Ukraine as another form of genocide is covered in New York law. It didn't pass. But to your point about what happened in Kurdistan, there shouldn't be a limit on what we teach. We need to teach about genocide wherever it occurs. And we have to broaden this concept that it's limited to these few things, which, by the way, we don't teach very well either, in my opinion. We have some schools do. But your point is very well taken, and that's one of the advantages of having a diverse group of people who represent communities. We have the first Muslim senator in our conference. We have the first person who is East Asian in our conference. The more we have people who bring these and say, you need to be talking about this as well. Like if you were a state senator, but we shouldn't have to have you as a state senator in order to include this in our conversation. Point well made. Yes, agreed.
I just wanted to note that the global way to do this is to have a very good world history course. And everybody, my feeling is if you can legislate it, every 5 years, every citizen has to retake world history.
That's going to be hard to pass.
And as a professor, I've had it very hard to get my colleagues to require it. Yes. Because there are so many other things to study. But I just wanted to say a very good world history course will at least, people will get a little bit of what's going on. Okay, I apologize.
Yes, this gentleman is very patient.
Okay, thank you, Mom. I do appreciate, of course, your speech. Quite enlightening and informative. I have a question that's related to, of course, your concern on the internet. and the need to regulate the internet space. I did a paper on existential risks, unknown and unknown, a paper that won for me the Intergenerational Justice Prize in 2022. And in that paper, I argue that an unregulated internet space in the long run will be worse than the Holocaust. The reasons are not far-fetched because of the increasing mob culture and, of course, the organized hate crimes against like disproportionate groups like the Hispanic or African American and other groups that are represented in the status quo. And part of my recommendation, of course, were already suggested by the OECD in 2017, and same was repeated in 2020. My question is, what do you think we should do differently to achieve some level of control on the usage of internet, especially as it concerns social media? And if we have to do that, how can we best achieve that without, of course, the pushback from liberal apologists and, of course, those who think that they are right and, of course, their self-determination in terms of what they use the internet space for should be protected and justified?
Well, I wish I knew the perfect answer to your question. I don't. I mean, in Congress in the United States, they're struggling with the right approach. I mean, we have this First Amendment issue where there's limits on regulating speech, but that's by government. So I think one interesting issue to me as a lawyer is, in some ways, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube sort of take on the role of the government purveyors of speech. If there's no one else giving news and it appears to be sort of sanctioned, they're a little bit like a public domain. Plus they go over the airwaves and things that are owned by the public. So I think there's a little more grounds to regulate them than traditionally was thought of because they're private, number one. Number two is sort of, they're international. They're not just the United States. So the whole world is dependent on them. So, I mean, in a perfect world, if the UN had power and really could achieve things, it would be an appropriate place for there to be a conversation. I don't know. I think in here, one thing, for example, just an example, one thing we're doing in social media in the legislature, we just changed some of the gun laws in New York, and we authorized the licensing agency, when you apply for a gun in New York, to look at your social media page and stuff to see if you said, like, I'm going to blow up a school. Now, people did not like that we moved into that space and said, it's legitimate for government to look at a person's history on social media. To me, it's stupid not to, because people say things publicly. It's just like looking for newspaper clips. But this is a tough area legally to regulate, I agree, but I think we have to come up with some solutions. And in a perfect world, they're more worldwide than US specific. But maybe you have better thoughts, and there may be other nations that have come up with better solutions. The United States, I think, is floundering a bit in this. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Okay, Spencer.
Yes. Great.
Maybe you're closing me out.
Yeah, perhaps. Once again, I very much appreciate your perspectives here today, your openness, and of course your engagement with everyone here today. I very much appreciate you being here. Just hearing the framework that you've laid out, in addition to the responses that you've given, your perspectives again are just extraordinarily inspiring. And with that, it reminded me, kind of in this sector of education, how inspiring teachers can be. And I think in education, of course, there is so much perspective on the student. Of course, that's why we have education, to prepare the next generation and to create these global and community members. But my question is, I'm curious, kind of in this role of teachers, I come from California, so I don't know the requirement specifically. Are teachers required to have master's degrees in New York State?
Not necessarily master's.
Okay.
You have to be certified.
Certified, so...
You can be on the different fields, different requirements.
Okay.
Obviously, like special
And
ed.
at different
There's
levels
different
of education.
gradations of requirement, but it's a highly regulated field in New York.
Great. So my follow-up question to that is, of course, I'm sure all of us in here can imagine and remember a teacher, an educator at some point in our lives that has inspired us to bring us where we are today. I mean, I have several in my mind. And so with that, in your district and throughout the state of New York, are there, how can we engage the participation and the access to that higher education so that educators can continue to inspire without those roadblocks that might exist in terms of that access to the education so that they can become educators?
I'm so glad you raised that, and I didn't deal with that, but it's something we're very committed to. One is for a greater diversity of teachers in the United States, and in New York we have a number of initiatives, one of which I went to the other day, which is encouraging young people in 7th and 8th grade to think about teaching as a profession, because for years teachers were denigrated in the United States as, you know, oh, they make too much money, they do nothing, they leave at 3 o'clock, they have the summers off. If you were here during COVID, these teachers were like carrying the load, and I'm sure that was true all over the world. I mean, you remember that story where teachers were teaching in other countries to kids in other countries? So one is we're trying to encourage greater diversity. We're trying to restore a sense that teachers bring value. Every day I met, just as an aside, the New York State Teacher of the Year, who is a young LGBTQ man who teaches in New York City schools. He is African American. He was homeless in the New York City schools, and he had a teacher who inspired him in science and math. Now, I know nothing about science and math. I totally stayed away from that. But this kid had a love for it, a talent for it. He made it through high school, college, got a master's, now teaches chemistry and biology in a New York City public high school, and was just named Teacher of the Year for the state of New York. And in part, the inspiration of having a teacher who changed his life. And I hear these stories all the time. So there is more we can do to build teachers up. There are some regulatory hurdles. They're less the problem than encouraging new people to get into this profession. Right now we have a shortage of teachers in the United States, a profound shortage. People retired after COVID. It was too hard and they had enough. We need a new generation of teachers with the kind of inspiration you're talking about. We're trying to work on that. So I think, am I completed with my responsibilities here? Thank you for the opportunity to come by, really. Thank you very much. If any of you want to see what American retail politics is, you're welcome to go with me to a train station while you're here. 6:30 in the morning. Many people say, no, I'm not interested. Let me just say that. Thank you very much.